What is universal basic income, and what do most people get wrong about universal basic income?
A basic income would be giving every individual, every man and every woman, equal, modest amount each month in cash or equivalent that they can use in whatever way they think fit. And it would be unconditional in terms of what they had to do to receive it. It's a right, it's an economic right, and unconditional in terms of having to do something in order to retain the right to a basic income. It would be a modest amount, initially at least, and it would give people a sense of basic security. And I've always advocated it as a mechanism of freedom, a mechanism of security, and a mechanism of social justice, in the sense that in society we have the commons, which have been handed down to us through many generations, whether it's in the Netherlands or in any other country. And that has been, it's our equal right. But it's been taken away by minorities, and they've made profit from our commons. And in a sense, you could say that it's a matter of justice that we all receive a dividend, a social dividend, on the collective wealth that's being created. Now, the most usual criticism is that it would be something for nothing, and it would deter labour supply, and that it would be too expensive and therefore impracticable. Now, the wealthy receive something for nothing every day of their lives. They are given inheritance. They've never done anything to deserve it, and they get it. If you are saying that there should be nothing, something for nothing, then you should say we should abolish all inherited wealth. I want to hear that from those critics, right? The second thing is that we've found from experiments and pilots that people who have basic security actually work more, not less. We've done a lot of pilots, a lot of experiments in many types of country. There are more than 100 experiments going on at the moment as we talk. And the third, it's eminently affordable. We would start at a low level and build up as the resources were mobilized. And the idea would be to build up a commons fund from dividends paid from a capital fund that was built up from taxes on those who are making profit or causing ecological decay and so on. And you build it, as you build it up, the level of basic income would rise. So for me, the main objections, and there are others that I've dealt with in my books, can be dealt with. They don't stand up to scrutiny. What I think is most important at this point in 2025, and we're talking with an election in the Netherlands in the background, and with Donald Trump causing chaos and dismay for the whole world, and with far-right movements growing all over the world, we must realize that if you don't provide people with basic security, basic economic security, you should not be surprised if they move to support populists and far-right neo-fascists, because they are promising something, and those of us who put ourselves on the left, if you like, so far the left has not provided any alternative route to giving people security. And we must realize that for a good society in Europe or in any other part of the world where I work a lot, it's essential for us to be providing security for people so that they can get up in the morning and feel that they can handle the day ahead. People who think that their children are not going to be penalized because of their own economic insecurities. Now, we can come back to those issues, But I think we are at a very, very sensitive point in history where we must realize that progressive economics, I'm an economist, progressive policies have to be saying to people, we will give you security so you can build your life and build your community and act within a community. And if we don't provide that, then hell is going to break loose.
Okay, so you said exactly that many mainstream progressive parties they ignored the wishes of the precariat, meaning that the right-wing populists successfully spoke to the anger of insecure workers, and that centrists and the left they maybe failed to address that. How can the left and centrist parties do a better job in addressing these issues?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that we're in the crisis point of a global transformation. I always draw on the great work of Karl Polanyi, who wrote a book in 1944 called The Great Transformation. And the thesis in his book is that a period comes where the economic system is out of control by society and laissez-faire or free market economics dominates. And during those periods, inequalities increase, insecurities increase, until we have a threat of the annihilation of civilization. And at that point, you either go into a period of fascism, authoritarianism, and far-right domination, anti-democratic situations, or you have a new system of gaining control of the economic system by society. And when I wrote the book, The Precariat, in 2011, I said, look, a new class structure is emerging, a new class structure where we have a plutocratic top, the plutocracy, billionaires and so on. Then you have a dwindling, a shrinking salariat, people with full-time employment, stable pensions and all that stuff. The old proletariat, the old working class is disappearing. It's vanishing from rich countries and in poor countries. And the precariat is emerging as the new mass class. And I said, unless progressive politicians understand the nature of the precariat, we will see the emergence, and I wrote this on page 1 of that book, we will see the emergence of a political monster. Those were the words I used. And in 2016, a lot of people, because the book's been translated into 25 languages, a lot of people from all over the world were writing to me and saying, your monster has arrived. And of course, it was Donald Trump. And we've got now Mark II of Donald Trump, who is far more mad and in control than he was in 2016. And we've got a situation where we need to respond to what the precariat stands for. And I always emphasize that the precariat is defined in 3 dimensions. The first dimension is the one you've just mentioned, and which is the one that journalists and political commentators always mentioned: stable, insecure employment. They have unstable jobs, etc. Now, that's nothing particularly new about that, except the numbers are so much greater than say, in the post-1945 era. That, for me, is not the most important aspect of the precariat. More importantly are things like, this is the first mass class in history where the level of education, the level of formal schooling, is higher than the level of labor they can expect to get. And more people in the precariat don't have a feeling of having any occupational narrative, any narrative of developing themselves through their work and leisure. And this is frustration, this is alienating, this is causing a lot of anger. And the second thing about the second dimension is that the precariat experience volatile incomes, very low incomes, and have to rely on money wages without access to non-wage benefits, without pensions, paid holidays, paid medical leave, and all that stuff. And that makes their lives much more insecure. And for the first time in history, precariat is a class that is being systematically exploited by debt. By debt. One mistake, one accident, one illness, and their whole life can collapse. And the third dimension, which I regard as the most important of all, is that the precariat has distinctive relations to the state. The existing state is an antagonistic entity for the precariat because it's taking away rights of citizenship, not just for migrants, but for everybody who's in the precariat. They're losing social rights. They don't get access to secure benefits. They're losing economic rights. They can't practice what they're qualified to do. They're losing political rights because they don't see in the political spectrum a party or movement that represents their interests and aspirations. And they ultimately feel like supplicants. They feel as if they have to rely on discretionary judgments from landlords, from employers, from bureaucrats, from parents, from friends, or whatever, moneylenders. And this creates a terrible set of insecurities. And on top of all that, we're living at a time of chronic uncertainty, where we don't know what shock is going to hit us next. We don't know. And a shock may hit you tomorrow or me tomorrow, and we don't know whether we can recover from it or cope with it because we don't know what impact. We can't predict it, and we can't have an insurance system to protect us. So this leads to the point that links with basic income. Because in a sense, you can see a basic income not as a panacea. You can see basic income as a sort of social vaccine. We take vaccines to protect us against disease, okay? We took the COVID vaccines not stopping us getting things so much as that if we got them, the consequences will be much less. I've just taken an injection for grippe for flu this winter, right? It's a vaccine. It will mean that if I get flu, it will be less threatening to my health and survival, if you like. And we needed the equivalent in the economy. And a basic income would be a sort of social vaccine. It gives you ex ante security. You know, I may be hit by a shock tomorrow. You may be hit by a shock tomorrow. You may really have a terrible thing, but at least you would know that you would be able to survive because you would be having that basic income. And I think that gives the context of basic income and the precariat. Now, at the moment, we are seeing the precariat developing in ways that I'm afraid I predicted, because I said I was invited to address the Bilderberg group, which is a far-right group, in 2016. And I said that there are three factions in the precariat. The first faction are what I call the atavists, who are not very educated. They listen to the Trumps and the people like them promising to bring back yesterday. You know, vote for me and I'll make America great again. I'll make the Netherlands great again, or whatever, rubbish. But they say it and they're promising something, okay? And for people who don't have a lot of education and are falling out of old working class communities, to be promised something is seductive. It is seductive. And that's why that part of the precariat has supported the Wilders, the Trumps, the Farages in Britain, the Malonis, the Orbans, the Trump, etc. And the plutocrats, who are the real ones making a profit from the system, are using that for their political base. Now, the second group in the precariat are the migrants, the millions and millions of people who are in different types of migrant status. I'm giving a lecture on them tomorrow in Neuchâtel. The migrants are part of the precariat, or large numbers of them are part of the precariat. And they, of course, won't support the fascists. They won't support the Trumps, etc. But they're disenfranchised and they're victimized. They're demonized. They are not the cause of the insecurities of all the precariat. They're not the cause. The cause is the fact that a tiny minority is taking the rental incomes and becoming billionaires and multi-billionaires and, crazy situations where you have one man who's got over $400 billion of wealth. They are the ones that are causing the insecurity because they're taking most of the money. That's the second group, the nostalgics, I call them, because they don't have a home anywhere, whether it's in the Netherlands or where they come from. The third group are the growing group, the group that goes to university, goes to college, and they were promised by their parents and teachers that if they did that, they would have a future. They would have a future. They come out knowing they bought a lottery ticket. They bought a lottery ticket. And that lottery ticket is worth less and less and less, and they are faced with debt and a feeling of worthlessness, of hopelessness. Now, we have to change that, and our politicians have to understand that the progressive part of the precariat is the growing part now. They're the growing part. And they want an ecological future. They want a linking with nature. They want a slow time movement. They want a connection. They want to be able to do work that is not labor. They want to be able to develop their personalities, their creativity, and so on. And this part of the precariat doesn't want to go backwards to the old social democratic era, and they don't want the neoliberal offerings of the far right. But at the moment, we have a vacuum. We have a vacuum. And that is what I've tried to address in my new books, in The Politics of Time and my new book that's coming out in January, because we need a progressive agenda that is reinventing the future, not in a utopian way, in a realistic way that is moving towards having more sense of the commons back, more sense of security, more sense of real education, more sense of leisure and sense of being in control of our lives and our relationships. And at the moment, we're at a dangerous point where old social democrats are holding us back because they still want to return to a situation where they put everybody into full-time stable jobs and blah, blah, blah with the old agendas. And it won't come back. It won't come back. And I don't think we should want it to come back. But we are at a very dangerous point where we have a fascist in the White House, and let's not pretend otherwise. I call him Caligula. He's a Caligula surrounding himself with horses and so on. But we are at a moment where the progressive part of the precariat is stirring. It is getting energy. And I'm actually confident, as long as we can survive Trump, which is not definite, that we can recreate a progressive politics that would be very exciting.
Okay, yes, you just mentioned your latest book, The Politics of Time. Could you maybe delve a bit deeper into how time and economic security are connected?
Yeah, I take the book as it was an outcome of a number of inspirations. If you go back to ancient Greece, they had a conceptualization of time that I think is far more relevant and constructive than our modern notions of time. They divided two ways. First, labor. Labor was done for exchange value for others, for bosses, for slave owners, for landlords and things. And that was different from work. Work was what you did with your friends and your family around the home. And a citizen tried to minimize labor and maximize work. The trouble is that historically, by the end of the 19th century, all work that was not labor disappears from notions of economics. So if I shift from working in an office or in a factory to spending time looking after my children or my elderly mother, national income goes down, employment goes down, and I'm accused of not doing any work. Now, that is, if a Martian came down to the world today and you said that, you say, what? You're mad. The most valuable work that we can do is for the loved ones in our life, our communities, growing vegetables and fruit, working in the community, all sorts of activities that are regarded as non-work. The second distinction that the ancient Greeks made was between recreation and leisure. Recreation, we need to do recreation. We need to play. One of the things that in my new book is how play has been strangled and even among children reduced to the detriment of their development. But we need play. But we also need leisure, which is different from recreation. And of course, in the modern neoliberal thing, it's all put together. People talk about leisure when really what they're talking about is consumption time and playing and watching television or watching the screens and a thing. Leisure meant public education and public participation in the life of society. And the distinction was important because a citizen, there were defaults with slavery and the way they treated women was disgusting, etc. But the concepts were relevant. And what I trace through in the book is how leisure has been depleted and work that is not labor has been depleted. And we have a laborism which the left and right regarded as the thing to do. So we have in the 20th century, we have social democratic parties want to maximize the amount of time and the number of people in jobs. Now, historically, that would have been regarded as mad. You know, even into the 19th century, workers and ordinary people would do anything they could to avoid being in jobs. Because being in jobs was being in a position of subordination, saying yes to a boss, yes sir, no sir, being under control, doing things that they don't want to do. Why do you want to maximize the time in jobs? Okay, we do jobs because they're needed. We need the income. So I'm not being utopian on things, but don't idealize it and romanticize it and say we should all be maximizing our time in jobs. Now, through the 20th century, we had an industrial time period where you could divide life into short time of school, if lucky, long time in labor, short time in retirement. You get up in the morning, you go to the factory or the office, you go home in the evening, have a little sex if you've still got energy, go to sleep. It was in blocks of time. But in the latter part of the 20th century, we had what I've called in the book tertiary time, where the boundaries between all activities break down. So more and more, we are doing a lot of work for labor, work off workplaces, outside labor time. If you're in the precariat, you have to spend an enormous amount of time doing work that is not labor. But you have to do it, because if you don't, you will pay a heavy price. Retraining. You have to retrain and retrain and retrain, because the last lot of skills that you learn become obsolescent and are forgotten. And you have to queue up for benefits. You have to apply for hundreds of jobs. I mean, if you're in the precariat, many people have to apply in the course of a few years, thousands of jobs. How much time do you use? Phenomenal amount of time. You don't get compensated for that. The same with queuing, waiting around, and we've lost control of time. And in that context, we need a politics of time which finds policies for reducing the amount of work for labor that we have to do and frees up our time and the incentives for spending more time in leisure, real education, not acquiring credentials and human capital so you can get a better job. That's not education. Education is about learning about yourself, about your culture, about your civilization, about your history, about art, about yourself. And we've lost that more and more. And that's the new book, which is called Human Capital, The Tragedy of the Education Commons. It's coming out in January. Basically, our education industry has been diseducating people, telling people that they must be more and more competitive. They must pass more exams. They must spend more time becoming multi-skilled and multi-this and multi-that, when in actual fact it's converting people into automatons that have lost control of their time and their culture. And that is a crisis why some people voting for the far right, because they're not educated. So we have a combination of a loss of control of time with a commercialization of our life, and that is creating this crisis for the precariat.
Yes, I agree, and leisure is probably maybe the most important thing when it comes to um, improving oneself and being able to develop in one's own ways. Um, Next to leisure, you've talked about how basic income can also lead to emancipation. Can you go maybe a bit deeper into that and what you have seen in the field?
Well, emancipation is a complex concept. We've done pilots in India, in Africa, in Latin America, in Canada, in Finland, in Wales just recently. And I think that it comes through the most important thing that we have seen with all these experiments is that the first and most important thing is it reduces stress. It reduces feelings of mental pressure, and it improves mental health. You can't be emancipated if you are living in chronic insecurity, in which stress is the dominant thing. You don't sleep well, you don't interact well with other people, you don't develop yourself, you make decisions, short-term decisions that are not necessarily beneficial in the long term, all that sort of thing. So I think the first thing you see when people have basic security is that they get better mental health. Now, I always say that the emancipation is threefold. First, if you have basic income, you have more capacity to make choices. And that is why I call it libertarian freedom, if you like. And that's why people like Milton Friedman and people on the right have come round to supporting some variant of basic income, because they recognize that for a market economy to function well, people must have enough security to be able to make choices one way or the other. I can respect that position. It's not my main concern, but that's the first. The second is that a basic income gives people liberal freedom. Now, liberal freedom is the freedom to be moral, the freedom to be able to make a decision because I think it is right, morally right. If you're chronically insecure and you've got a crying baby and you're worried about where the next meal is coming from, you will do anything to survive, right? And you will recognize what you do is not the moral thing. You just do it because you have to do it. People who have basic security are more likely to make moral decisions. That's freedom. That's freedom. To be able to make a decision because I think it is the right thing to do. And the third form of freedom is what we call Republican freedom. And that is freedom from being under control of people or institutions of unaccountable domination. And to give a simple example, a woman is not free if she has to ask her husband or a father or a partner whether she can do X, Y, and Z, even if she knows that 99% of the time he will say yes. A woman is only free if she can make that decision herself, regardless of what anybody else thinks. And I remember when we did a pilot in Southern Africa, and at the end of the pilot, I went to one of the villages, and I called some young women across, teenagers, and I said to them, what's the best thing for you of having had this basic income for nearly 2 years? What's the best thing? And they giggled and, they were embarrassed and they're timid. They were teenagers. I was a foreigner, etc. But eventually one of them said, I'll tell you what, before we had our basic income, when the men came down from the fields at the end of the month with their wages in their pockets, we had to say yes. Now we have our basic income, we can say no. That's emancipation. And I think, as I said at the beginning, I don't think basic income is a panacea. I don't believe that it should be seen just as a single policy. It must be seen as part of a progressive agenda, reviving the commons, reviving real education, etc., deliberative democracy, and so on. But I think that it is a fundamental element of any progressive policy. So I'm talking to you in one of the richest countries in the world. And don't tell me that you can't guarantee every Dutch person a basic income. Come on. It's crap to say otherwise. It's real crap. So I think emancipation is vital. I think we are living in a time when more and more people do not feel free. They do not feel free. And I can understand that. And I think that those of us who have the capacity to speak up should take that responsibility of saying that must be our agenda.
In the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned universal basic income. You mentioned basic income. Could you please explain the difference and why you prefer basic income over universal basic income?
I think for political reasons, if I say universal basic income and I'm speaking to a large audience wherever I speak, and I talk all over the world, if I say universal, that will alert people to saying, what do you mean to say that every person who comes into the Netherlands would be given a basic income? That's what universal means. And I would say no. I would say every usual legal resident of the Netherlands should be receiving the basic income. I'm all in favor of giving support for migrants, and I'm not hostile to migrants. I'm a migrant myself. So in many respects, migrants need help, but it should be help outside the basic income system, because otherwise it's not going to be politically feasible. No one will vote for it. And I would say, look, it is a badge of legal citizenship. It's a badge of usual resident. If you or me are living outside our country, we would not be receiving the basic income in that country. That would be fair. That would be fair. And I think it should be seen as a payment, an economic right for those who are living, working, residing in their country. 2 points that I would add. One is that I think that once a person has been a legal resident, a migrant, for 1 or 2 years, then they should become entitled to it. And the other point I want to make, which I should make more emphatically at the beginning, is that for people with disabilities who've got extra costs of living, then there should be a supplement to the basic amount. Because the idea is you give everybody equal basic material security. So a person who's got more costs, should be given a supplement.
Okay, maybe it's a good question then. How would basic income relate to other current and existing welfare programs, and how does it differ? Maybe what are the benefits of basic income instead of the welfare programs we already have?
Well, the first thing I think is we need to move away from this drift to means testing and drift to behavior testing for entitlement to benefits, workfare, if you like. I think that is fundamentally wrong. It's paternalistic. It's misguided. It leads to bad decisions. It leads to what we call high exclusion errors, where a lot of people would be entitled, but they don't receive it. I think we need other benefits. We need housing benefits. We need rent control. We need disability benefits. We need child benefits. And we need pension systems. But if you have a basic income, you can convert all of those into supplements rather than pretend that they deal with the whole of the people's income needs. And I would reduce means testing as far as possible. Means testing creates poverty traps. In other words, if you are only giving to the poor, then if they try to become non-poor, they lose those benefits. So therefore they either don't try or they lie and they cheat and they risk being criminalized. Now, I mean, you don't need to be an Einstein to work it out that system is stupid. But that's what we've got. That's what we've got. And I never understand how any progressive person can think that targeting to the poor is a good system. You know, Richard Titmuss famously said, benefits that are only for the poor are invariably poor benefits. And that is a fact. So I would have other benefits and services. I mean, we need a national health service. We need good education that people can afford. We need an insurance system, a social insurance system that we can take out, insure against various things. But there should be a base, an anchor, if you like, of the whole system.
Hmm. I'm very curious about your intellectual influences. Who are some of your heroes or thinkers that have had the biggest impact on how you view the world?
That's a very nice question. I could give you a long answer, and I'll try to give you a short answer, which is, I think I've been influenced by people who combine a sense of social solidarity and a social justice with a romantic, progressive set of values. So I think of, in my own context, my own culture, William Morris, Thomas Paine, also Karl Marx, also many people of the Levelers and many people, Winstanley, which it probably means nothing to you, but people in my culture who have combined those attributes, Ruskin and so on. But I also think that the romantic poets, the romantic artists of the 19th century embodied many of the Enlightenment views trying to break out. So one is influenced by a range of people. For example, I'm heavily influenced by Hannah Arendt, a wonderful German intellectual of the middle decades of the last century. I think she's been a very influential figure in my own development. Karl Polanyi was clearly another influential character. And I went to Cambridge. I did my PhD at Cambridge at a time when the progressive economics was represented by a body of people. And then suddenly we had an economics revolution with the Chicago boys and all of those people whom intellectually I hate, who have distorted the economic system globally and have multiplied inequalities. Notice inequalities, because there are many forms of inequality, and chronic insecurity as a result of their egotistical, narcissistic policies and proposals. And I think that the undermining of social solidarity and the values that are nurtured by the great progressive traditions has been one of the terrible things that of the last 30 years. But I believe it's changing. I think there's now a new generation of people who are rigorously opposed to the neoliberal agenda.
Mhm. We also hear a lot more about UBI or basic income in relation with AI and job automation. What is your view on AI automation, and how do you think this will change or maybe even accelerate the coming of basic income?
Well, I've written a book called The Corruption of Capitalism, in which I argue that we don't have a free market, we have a system of rentier capitalism, where more and more of the income is going to the owners of property, physical property, financial property, and intellectual property. And AI is ultimately a form of property. It's generating a whole lot of intellectual property rights, rentier incomes flowing to the plutocrats, to the multi-billionaires. And I personally don't think it's going to remove all work. What we've seen in the course of the electronics revolutions that have been going on now for 30 years, don't forget, is in actual fact there are more jobs than at any time in history. There are more jobs today than at any time in history. And yet the technology is advanced much more than at any time in history. So I don't think that it's suddenly going to remove everything, but I do think that it is increasing inequality dramatically. And it is the first technological revolution which is reducing labor but increasing work. It's a very difficult way of explaining it. But for example, every time you and I open our computer, we are doing work for the technology company. They're making profit. Every time you and I go on our computers, they're making millions from our work. I have to do far more work than I used to, probably do 60 hours a week, and I'm getting on a bit, as you were. But we're doing more work. But most of that work is unpaid. And more of the income is going to the owners of AI and so on. I had a meeting with Sam Altman in 2016, and he asked me about basic income. And he is the inventor of ChatGPT, as you know, and he has become a multi-billionaire. And he told me that he was convinced by basic income because he thought AI would result in joblessness. I think his prediction is not quite right, but I'm quite happy that people like him are supporting basic income. Sometimes my friends on the left say, here, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and all these people are supporting basic income, it must be wrong. This is ridiculous. The Romans liked to build straight roads. Mussolini liked to build straight roads. Just because Mussolini built straight roads, should I not like straight roads? This is ridiculous, okay? It's a stupid argument. But they argue that, from their point of view, the inequalities and, they think, labor displacement will be that people can't afford to buy the goods produced by AI. And I'm happy to hear them say that, because they will support a basic income. And I support basic income for other reasons, for emancipation, for justice, for security, for freedom. But the fact is that quite a lot of these characters now support a basic income. And I think that makes it even more essential for the left, the broad left defined, the Greens, the left in general, should take up the challenge. Because one of the arguments against giving a basic income is that there would be a flight of capital, that the rich would leave the country because somebody's got to pay for it, and they would leave the country. But that's not the case. If you designed it well, then you could provide basic income. It would improve the economic system. It would give people security and freedom and all the things we're talking about. And actually, the plutocrats would accept it. It's a win-win situation. And we must realize that it's the way it's designed, it's the way it's combined with other policies that is the real challenge. And that, I think, is where we are today. But I've been asked to give talks in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and so on. And I've found it surprisingly easy to persuade them, to the very wealthy people, billionaires, not the sort of people I normally meet or mix with, but they understand it. And therefore I say to my friends on the left, wake up, wake up, wake up. Because out there in the precariat, they're living in chronic insecurity and misery, and suicide rates are going up. Deaths of despair are going up. Morbidity is going up. Early deaths. Criminality is going up because out of desperation. Why? Because people are insecure. And I'm not going to condemn people or support them for doing petty crimes or whatever, but these are realities. If I was in those circumstances, I am sure I would behave just as badly, if you like. And we must be humble. We must show empathy. And the election in your country is classic situation where there's muddle in the political sphere, and we need to get out of that muddle. I'm all in favor of joblessness. I'm all in favor of joblessness. I think I would like a politician to stand up and say, my policies are going to reduce the number of jobs by 10%. Reduce jobs. Because what it would mean is that we would be able to spend more time on the work that we really want to do. No man goes through life wishing he had spent less time looking after his children. No man goes through life wishing he'd spent less time looking after his dying mother. Okay? But there are a hell of a lot of men who go through life wishing they'd spent less time in the office. That's a way of putting it, right? So, I'm not afraid of joblessness, because I think we have to realize that, throughout history, the past 3,000 years, the majority of people were never in jobs. They did work around the home, they did work in their fields, they did work, whatever it was, and they did commoning together, sharing activities, etc., building their communities. and they weren't in jobs. Okay. Well, only in the last 200 years have jobs been regarded as something up here to be put on a pedestal. So I think we are in a revolutionary moment in the sense that we have need a new vocabulary and new images, new visions that are perfectly realistic. No, not science fiction or anything like that. They're perfectly realistic, and we have to move in that direction. In that direction, and that includes saying that jobs are not that important as long as we have opportunity to do work that we want to do and leisure that we could usefully do, and we have income security.
Mhm. Yes, yes, and I think it's also important that meaningful work. Yeah, if we can do that and could do more of that, that would be perfect. And the jobs that are um, maybe devastating to people or are dangerous, especially child labor. If we could get less of that, especially it's maybe through automation and other stuff, that would be something a worthy goal.
Sure.
I have a question about how you envision the future. Say 20 years from now, if policies like UBI are adopted or if they aren't, what do you think will happen and how do you see the future?
Well, um, the, the final chapter of my book, The Politics of Time, is an allegorical imagining of 20 years' time from now. And it imagines that in any European society, there is a realization for the need of a progressive alliance of parties on the left that wants to create a society where commons and the commoning are given high priority. And I go through a set of policies that are introduced in my imaginary 20 years process. And of course, it includes the introduction of a basic income, but it also includes an extension of deliberative democracy. It includes a resurrection of the commons in various sorts, of permaculture, of allotments, of a society of institutions that give people collective bargaining in society in a different way from the trade unions, but in a way that a civil society, and that has what I call eco-fiscal policies for paying things. I believe in a carbon tax, for example. I believe in taxes of bads, of things that are ecologically destructive, and putting those into a fund and building up the fund to pay out the rising basic income. So I explain in that chapter how it's done, and for me, I think you would see that the commons are what unite us. And the commons are what historically gave people, the expression in English is they gave the poor an overcoat. An overcoat. So you could have access to the commons, social commons, inherited institutions and things. And I think we need to resurrect them and deprivatize them. And I explain how that can be done in that chapter. And one little example, which you as a Dutch man could appreciate perhaps with a smile, is that in Denmark, they have a wonderful new innovation of sea allotments, community gardens in the sea. And a number of places, see, you are brought to a smile because it's a nice concept, right? It's and the idea is that you have a certain area that you allow people to grow shellfish or fish or seaweed or whatever it might be in that area, and they pay a small rent to the local authority. And of course, if you do it in the sea, very quickly, because the plot next to you is run by somebody else, and you're affected, the water goes in all the. So you have to have it, but do it collectively, even if you have your individual allotment. Now, around your coast, around most countries, there are wonderful opportunities of doing sea allotments. Now, if you're like me and love eating seafood, then you can see this would be a way of indulging us in nature, reproduction, because we would want to reproduce the resources. We would not want to deplete them. We would understand that ecologically we would be about reproduction, because that is the way that we would continue, and our families and friends, etc., would continue. And that would strengthen our ecological values.
You have had a successful career, and a very impactful one. Looking back, maybe what would be a piece of advice you would give to your 20-year-old self that is just starting out?
Oh, without a doubt, I would say follow your enthusiasms. I think that we all need to realize that making decisions to increase our creativity and try to do what we would like to do is so important. And I think also I would say to myself, if I were 20 years old, I think we all have a responsibility to be political animals in the sense of participating in society and not caring solely about ourselves. I think empathy is one of the most important things we should be learning in school and university and through our life. And I think empathy is something that's being sacrificed by neoliberalism, and we need to recover it and tell ourselves and our friends and our loved ones that we should always try to put ourselves in the other's position and realize that their problems could be our problems. And we should realize that they are struggling. And that, I think, is a golden rule. Do unto others what you would wish they would do to you. And at the moment, politically, we're seeing all this hateful talk, all this spiteful thing. We're witnessing genocide in Gaza, and we know it. And governments are not doing anything to stop it. You know, today, more bombs, more schools have been destroyed. And I think I would say to myself at age 20, be angry and be active, because in the end, we should all be doing our little bit. And I think we're suffering at the moment from what I call vicarious trauma. Vicarious in the sense that these horrors are happening to other people elsewhere, be it Gaza, be it Sudan or wherever, and our politicians and our institutions are not doing anything to stop it. And today, like the last 3 years, the bombing continues, the killing continues, and we hear about it. And it makes most of us really angry, but it feeds into a depressing effect on ourselves. And we need to stand up together far more. And that's, I would say to my 20-year-old self, make sure you do that. And I would say that to my children. I would say that to my friends. And I think we have a responsibility as human beings to do that.
Thank you so much for that answer. I have one final one, and that is if people want to know more about you or what you're working on, and if they want to know more, where can they find you?
My webpage is easily just Guy Standing. As I said, I got this new book coming out. It'll be controversial. I'll make more enemies, I'm sure. But I feel very strongly about the miseducation that's taking place in the world at the moment, the loss of education, of morality, of this subject of empathy, the sense of pursuit of respect for truth. And I, I think you can find my work through my web and order it online, the books, and anybody who reads them, or please feel free to contact me with comments. I must say I could write volumes from people who send me their reactions and thoughts, because they often have profound insights that we miss. So that is part of being I suppose, a public figure of some sort, that you get that feedback, and it can be very rewarding. You also get insults. You get very rude stuff sent your way, and it hurts, and I won't pretend otherwise. But you can find out more through my webpage.